welcome to the Election Show on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Greer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University and co-host of the FAQ NYC podcast. Joining me today, as always, via Zoom is Matt McDermott, Communications Strategist and Vice President of Whitman Insight Strategies. And also with me is political analyst and Professor of Political Science at Columbia University, Lincoln Mitchell. I love being with you all every week. By the time this airs next on Sunday, we'll be less than 2 months away. Today is day 58 until we get to Election Day. And Donald Trump, even though he's lagging in some of the polls, he still has quite a bit of support. We see him at a rally in Michigan, thousands of people showing up maskless to support him. But he's had a pretty rough week. You would know it by watching Fox News, but there have been some comments about veterans, and also Bob Woodward's book came out. So Matt, I'm gonna start with you today. Let's first start with the veterans. It's come out that Donald Trump has essentially called them suckers and losers in a special parade. He said he didn't want injured service members who have lost limbs, who have been disabled because of various wars and interactions, because it was bad for morale and he didn't want to look at it. But some veterans are still holding steadfast and supporting him. Help us walk through this conundrum of Donald Trump and what seems like he just has a total disrespect for Americans writ large, but some of our most esteemed Americans. And he's almost Teflon sometimes.
And the thing I'll say first is, I think it's important for us to remember is this is the part of the cycle that gets exciting, right? Is between now and Election Day, essentially every day is Election Day, because we already have voters across America voting by mail-in ballot. So we already have in North Carolina, for instance, over 10,000 voters have already voted in this presidential election. And so it's not great for Donald Trump when we're sitting through a week like we have this week, and he's on the defense every day. First, because of the military story that you mentioned, wherein Donald Trump essentially ridiculed active military members and veterans for serving their country in the way that they did. We'll recall that Donald Trump did not do that and actually used a fake medical excuse to get out of his own service when he was younger in life. And then later in the week with the Bob Woodward news, wherein Donald Trump essentially hid the severity of the coronavirus pandemic from the American people to, quote, avoid panic, and in the meanwhile let 200,000 Americans die, himself knowing how severe this crisis was. And so by any measure has not been a good week for Donald Trump. And as I mentioned, the difficulty for him is that every day from here through November is itself an election day, because we already have so many Americans voting. So I think the Trump campaign after this week needs to figure out what their message to the American people actually is, because at the moment, they're just swerving from, frankly, one defensive strategy to another, and have still not really figured out what a cohesive strategy for winning this election is for them.
Right, I've been calling it the spaghetti noodle strategy, where they literally, each day it seems as though they're throwing something at the wall to see if it sticks, whether it's to Biden, whether it's to Kamala Harris. Lincoln, where are you and what are you hearing and analyzing when it comes to Donald Trump and his speech about veterans, but also moving forward to the Bob Woodward book, where essentially, as Matt mentioned, he's lied to the American public. He knew the danger that the coronavirus posed to the public. And even though he incites panic every day, or tries to incite panic every day on Twitter about Cory Bookers of the world moving into suburbs and threatening white women, he doesn't really have a message, but he still has probably close to 55 or 60 million Americans who will vote for him.
I might look at this from two perspectives here. The first is this question of the Trump campaign strategy. One of the challenges of the Trump campaign is that even if they do have a cohesive strategy and a plan, even if they have a minute-by-minute plan between what to do between now and when the polls close on November 3rd, they cannot execute that plan no matter how good it is, because they have an erratic president who is incapable of following a plan, processing new information, or behaving with any discipline. If you were running this campaign, if I were running this campaign, and I want to preface this by just for the voters, for the viewers, I'm not running this campaign.
Thank God none of us
are running this campaign. My wife would divorce me. My kids would stop speaking to me. My mother would leave all her money to the dog, okay? But if I were running the campaign, the first thing I would do is shelve Donald Trump, right? Him going out there and having a rally and speaking or doing this interview with John Hannity, anything like that, that makes Donald Trump feel good, but it doesn't move voters towards him. So the strategy can't include Donald Trump because he's so toxic. The way you campaign in this is you tell a story about what we can do, how dangerous Biden is, and you try to downplay Trump's erratic behavior, authoritarian tendencies, bigotry, mean-spiritedness, and ignorance. But it's very difficult to do that given Donald Trump. To your second question, I very much agree with you. In my view, the outcome that would be really the equivalent of a modern-day landslide for Biden would still have Trump getting 45% of the vote. Very hard to imagine a scenario where he gets less than that. And for me, the key to this is the information worlds in which people live. So Bob Woodward, who's been around Washington forever, has a recording of Donald Trump, who lives by creating panic. His professional life is dedicated to creating panic, saying, I didn't want to create panic. Therefore, 190,000 Americans are dead, right? But there are people. So this is a credible source. It's an insider Washington. Whether you like Bob Woodward or not, he has the recordings, right? But for many people, if Fox News and Donald Trump's press conference and OAN and all those other organizations and news organizations say one thing, that's what they believe. And you can call it a cult-like mentality. You can be more charitable and call it a suspicion of the mainstream media. You can be more honest and call it a commitment to the racism that Trump represents, however you want to spin it. But that information, how people get their information, is critical to understanding the stubborn support for Donald Trump that has never really dipped meaningfully below 40%.
Right. Well, I've always said, one of the most dangerous aspects of his presidency and his administration is to call into question the validity of the media. And so we saw at one of his most recent rallies in Michigan, a Times reporter tweeted that, there were thousands of people without masks, and she was promptly removed from the rally. But Lincoln, I want to stick with you really quickly because you mentioned something about the election in November and the integrity of the election, which you have been ringing this alarm, as the three of us have, but you have been, I would say, ringing it the loudest. And as we get closer to the election date, you talked about sort of shelving the candidate because he's erratic, because his messaging is off, because he hasn't been interested in expanding his base over 3.5 years. But the Republican Party also doesn't seem too worried about that, which makes me worried because I then feel like they have other strategies in places like Michigan and Wisconsin and North Carolina and Pennsylvania, Florida and Arizona, states that could really make a difference, states that we saw were in play in 2016. And so when we think about the integrity of the elections, we've already heard stories now about, his defense folks saying, we're not going to give reports about Russian interference. The president doesn't like to hear it. We've heard stories about, districts in Florida already being targeted by Russian interference and possibly Russians having the capability to change some of the voting machines. And then there's that widespread sort of voter disinformation that we saw constantly in Michigan and Wisconsin, especially targeting Black voters and voters that were sort of pushed to vote for a third-party candidate to assist Donald Trump. This is worrisome as we are almost 2 months out from the election. What should Biden and Democrats be doing to either get information out to voters or to try and combat this? I mean, we've already heard that possibly the Biden administration has been hacked. His consultants have been hacked by Russian interference. So what are we to do in 2 months, knowing that this threat is now real?
Well, there's a lot there in that question. The first thing I would say is that I've worked on election fairness issues around the world. And one of the things I used to say when I would talk to people in different countries is there are many ways to steal an election. In America, we do it with lawyers. This was after the Bush-Gore campaign in 2000. But I want to just go back to the first part. There are many ways to steal an election. What you talked about in your question was the front end. How do we make it harder for some people to vote? How do we create disinformation? How do we conceal information from the American people? Those kinds of things. But the back end, what we're seeing now in the last week or so, is what the back end is going to look like, right? So there will be efforts to stop the counting of mail-in ballots in places like Wayne County in Michigan, or not to rhyme, but Dane County in Wisconsin, right? Democratic strongholds in purple states. You can challenge those ballots because the signature that I wrote when I voted doesn't match when I registered 20 years ago, right? So that can slow the process down. That's done by lawyers. In this case, that legal effort will be bolstered by thuggy Trump supporters with guns on the outside. That seems very likely. So what can the Biden campaign do? The first thing the Biden campaign can do, and anybody around the Biden campaign, is understand and speak about this campaign as a two-tiered struggle. One, to win the election and get more votes, and two, to have a fair election and to bring democracy, right? And if we confront and recognize that this election is being stolen, we are making progress in stopping it from being stolen. The Republican narrative, by the way, is now the Democrats will claim election fraud if Trump wins. Well, we will, because they're already committing it, right? But the second piece is don't rely just on the legal strategy. If the Democrats go out there with lawyers to adjudicate cases in states like, just to pick a few important ones, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Florida, which all have majority conservative Supreme Courts, they will lose that, right? And if the Republicans are also sending, like they did in Michigan when they were upset about Gretchen Whitmer's policies around the coronavirus, people with guns, the Democrats have to respond with massive peaceful demonstrations, both in the places where the votes are being counted, so that outside of that counting place in Wayne County, which for those who don't know is where Detroit is in Michigan, there is a large, diverse, peaceful group of people with signs that say things like we support democracy, or count all the votes, juxtaposed with the thuggy armed Trump supporters, as well as massive rallies in places like New York, where the state isn't in question, but to show that the American people want democracy. That kind of pressure gets through to courts, it gets through to state legislators, and ultimately public opinion is going to matter, but you can't do it just with the lawyers.
So, Matt, I want you to respond to what Lincoln has just said, but also, as a strategist, we've also seen, these peaceful protests have external folks come in to disrupt that peace. And so there's a mixed messaging in the strategy of that peaceful protest sometimes. But what it sounds like Lincoln is saying is that we have a two-tier strategy that we have to deploy, sort of pre-November 3rd and then the post-November 3rd. As a strategist, walk us through also what the next 2 months should and could look like for us, for the Biden camp especially, and what they should be telling us or Democrats to do. And then also, what does it look like afterwards? Where we've talked about, the races in New York, where Carolyn Maloney's race, because of so many absentee ballots, it did take quite some time to know who the winner of that race was. And it was called into question as to whether or not, the ballots were counted accurately. And obviously the president picked up on that to help with his messaging.
I mean, as a strategist, I've been listening to this conversation for the past 5 minutes and thinking to myself, this is exactly why Donald Trump is losing right now, right? It is just exhausting for the everyday person to listen to this conversation, just frankly, the insanity of this conversation, the eroding of our democratic norms before our very eyes, the having to turn on the evening news every day and see yet another story about the insanity of this presidency. And people are just tired of it. I mean, I cannot tell you how many focus groups I've sat in with persuadable voters across the country who the number one thing they say about this election is, oh, I just want to return to a time in my life when I didn't have the president beating down my door every day with his insanity. And so that really is sort of the construct of this election at the moment, is so many voters are just tired of the insanity of this conversation. On the flip side, part of the reason we need to have this conversation is because that insanity, and in part because that insanity is really threatening the fairness of our electoral system. And I think the Biden campaign has smartly framed this election in the way that it should be. It really is an election wherein you are going to vote for a restoration of our democracy in Joe Biden, or you are voting for the decline into, frankly, fascism that the Trump administration has led us towards. There is a substantial voting population out there who's saying, you know what, I don't typically vote for Democrats. Joe Biden seems fine to me, but more than anything else, Joe Biden needs to be elected because we need to restore some semblance of normalcy to not only our government, but our overall society and democracy therein. So I think in some sense, this cake is already baked. It's why this race has been so stable over the past few months, because the average American person knows what they're voting for at this point. They're either voting for some sense of normalcy, some sense of restoration in our democracy, or they're voting for Donald Trump. And I think just, in my gut, the optimistic view that I have on this country, I think we will see in 50 odd days some sense of closing the book on this chapter. And frankly, Democrats really needing to use the time thereafter to say, what do we need to do, to Lincoln's point, what do we need to do to make sure this never happens again? Because I think Lincoln has correctly been beating the drum on this. There have been so many erosions of our norms across our system of government that there are going to need to be substantial structural changes after this election to make sure we never live through this situation ever again.
Okay, so Matt, I want to follow up because I feel like you've got the optimistic point of view, which I sometimes have. I do.
I never have.
But, right, I think I'm in the middle, right? So it's Lincoln on one side, I'm in the middle, Matt's on the other side. But as a Black person in this country, knowing what this country is capable of, and knowing what voters in this country are capable of ignoring in elected officials, what worries me is that, I don't think it should be this close, because I do feel like it's close. We're going to leave interference outside. We're going to leave all the cheating and the theft that we do know is going to happen. But I think that there's so many Americans, too many Americans, that lie because they don't want to say that they're supporting a white nationalist or someone who is accused by over 20 women of sexual assault, but they like the tax breaks and they're fine with that. For some people, I don't think that they are experiencing the chaos that we're experiencing. I think that they're watching news outlets that say that the Democrats are just being hysterical liberals and having a tempest in a teapot almost every day about nothing. I mean, going to a point where someone mentioned a reporter said at the rally, people are saying it's only 10,000 people who have died from coronavirus. You all are just lying about the numbers. So again, going back to my point about the media being called into question from day one with Donald Trump and his supporters, that worries me. I guess I don't feel like I'm rolling into November 3rd because so many Democrats feel lackluster about Joe Biden, because so many Republicans can't seem to find a moral compass to care about this country over Donald Trump. That's leadership and voters. I think that's why I'm somewhat at a loss.
And I think you bring up a really good point as well, which is that beyond sort of overcoming the electoral realities of this year and needing to reform our democracy, I think the past 4 years, by any measure, have been an indictment on our media institutions in this country. And specifically, we need to have a reckoning in this country with the fact that there is a national, they call themselves a news network, and Fox, which distributes essentially propaganda to millions of Americans a day. And to your point exactly, there is an ecosystem in this country where voters are only getting their information from propaganda networks. They're not getting legitimate news that looks at the issue critically and provides an informative read to the person who's reading it. They're listening to propaganda, which at the moment is coming from the Trump White House. Even if he were to leave, it's still going to be an arm of the Republican Party. And we need to grapple with that. We have a media industry today that cannot just step out and say, look at what Fox is doing. We at NBC and CNN and CBS and ABC should not be associating with that as legitimate news. And so I think there has to be an honest assessment. Frankly, it should have happened already, but especially after this election, of what are we even doing here? How do we find it acceptable that a network like Fox has a front row seat in the White House briefing room? They are not
or
a
own
network. Yeah, or OANN or any of them, Breitbart. There's a slew of right-wing propaganda networks that are just distilling their message to voters in a way that just skews reality. And it's how we got Donald Trump. So there are so many issues we need to address in this country. For me personally, we just need to get through the November election to deal with them. But you're right, is frankly, in a Biden administration, Fox News should not have a seat in the White House briefing room. And I know there are many that disagree with me for the sake of fairness, but that is not a network that is inherently fair. And we need to just admit that. If they want to spew information to millions of Americans every day, fine. Don't give them a microphone to the highest office in the land every single day to be able to do it.
You know, both of us teach political science at the collegiate level, and we know that history tells us incumbents have an advantage. And so we aren't necessarily talking about the incumbency advantage of Donald Trump. Yes, he got a shellacking in the midterm elections, but it is pretty difficult to knock off an incumbent who's running. I mean, even if they are an abject failure and lazy and watch 9 hours of television and are completely self-navel-gazing. So how much does that factor in to your assessment of Biden taking, as the challenger, taking on someone who's already sitting in the Oval Office?
I want to just pick on something Matt said before I answer that question, if I may, which is, I don't disagree with what he was saying about Fox News, but others in the media, CNN, the New York Times, the major networks, they all missed the story and they continue to miss it. They refuse to cover the Trump presidency as a potential descent into authoritarianism until very, very recently. And they still are looking at an election that is being stolen in real time by the sitting president and covering the horse race. Oh, Trump is picking up white Latino voters or something. That's not the story. The story is the collapse of American democracy. And from the beginning, there was almost a commitment not to see that story. With regards to your question about incumbency, one of the reasons it was difficult for incumbents to lose in the past is that partisanship was weaker. So that an incumbent in good times, when things were going well, could get reelected much more easily. There were more voters out there to persuade. Similarly, if things were going badly, people would leave them. But, Lyndon Johnson, as an incumbent, got reelected in a boom time before the Vietnam War started, while the economy was very strong, with almost 2/3 of the vote. But it's unimaginable today that many people would leave the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. The other thing is that Donald Trump hasn't used incumbency. And I don't want to be insensitive, because COVID has killed 190,000 people, including, at least one person with whom I was extremely close, right? So that's not an abstraction for me. But this should have been something that sealed Trump's victory. Any halfway competent, halfway human president would have done that. As tragic as this is, not only was the death toll could have been much lower, but this could have been presented by the president totally differently. If in early February, early March even, he starts saying, we're going to listen to the health experts. This is a terrible thing. We're going to have to shut down. And then when we got the news change, when the media science changed, start wearing a mask. If he talked about social distancing, if he'd done the basic thing of coming on every week or every day and just saying, we've lost this many thousand people. We're an American community. This is terrible. This is turnkey stuff for a president. And Trump didn't do it. So he squandered away the real benefits of incumbency, which is a time of crisis, being the most visible, soothing face around. And he was incapable and uninterested in doing that.
Right. And he could have ignored the fact that he defunded the agencies that, would have helped prevent this, but he could have ignored that and shown real leadership. I think that is a great point.
I'll just add on sort of, the power of incumbency. The reason there's a power of incumbency is because there are a significant number of voters in this country who like stability. They like status quo. The challenge for Donald Trump is there's not that power of incumbency because he's the most unstable president that we've had in American history. And so what any other president might get from incumbency, that sort of appreciation for the status quo, is just negated for Donald Trump because there's nobody in America that thinks Donald Trump is a stable president.
Right. And some people like that erratic brashness. Let's talk about former Vice President Joe Biden. Matt, I'm going to stay with you. So Joe Biden's strategy has been pretty steady. He's going to swing states. He's showing compassion. I mean, I think everyone knows that this is where Joe Biden thrives. I mean, his losses have been well documented. He's been very open and honest in sharing with us the loss of his wife and daughter, and then more recently his son. His son served in the U.S. military, so he's a military family person. We know Jill Biden worked very, very hard on those issues when she was the second lady. How is he doing? Because there's still, at least in my assessment, in my analyses, there's still far too many young people, when I talk to my students, who are not interested in him or this race. Many are still considering sitting it out or do the protest vote, which is voting for a third-party candidate. I think he shored up, obviously, the older African-American vote. There's still quite a few Black men of a certain age and class in particular states who are not interested, and they're listening to either Trump propaganda or the Susan Sarandon-esque type folks of the world and willing to vote for a third party. And in a place like Michigan or Wisconsin, that is detrimental to the Democratic Party. So really briefly, how is Biden? How's he doing as a consultant? What grade would you give him in, say, an assessment 2 months before the election?
I mean, so far an A. Like, if you look at the average of the polls from March to May to today, they essentially have not changed. Biden is up by 7 or 8 points nationally, continues to hold a lead in basically every important swing state. What I think the Biden campaign needs to do, if we learned a lesson from 2016, is appreciate the fact that the Trump campaign's saving grace is they hope for some unexpected story in October to just blow the gasket on this race. And so against Hillary Clinton, it was the FBI deciding 2 weeks before the election to open up a federal investigation into a major party nominee, only to announce a day or two before the election that there was nothing there. So we should expect that there's going to be some sort of October surprise against Biden. It's how the Trump campaign expects to win this election. I think the Biden campaign needs to start beating the drum that we as voters need to expect that, and we can't be dissuaded by that. We need to know it's coming. We need to know it's false. We need to know more likely than not it's foreign interference in our elections, and we need to move past it. And frankly, the media needs to recognize that as well, because unlike 2016, where they failed readers, they need to know what's happening here and why this interference is happening so close to an election, and be able to overcome it and focus on what actually matters in this election.
And Lincoln, can you respond to that, especially since we've seen, outlets like the New York Times still not getting it, still not understanding authoritarianism, still not understanding race and racism on so many levels? What is Biden to do, and what are we to do in response?
Biden's running a strange campaign here in that it's working, but the pundits don't like it, right? So it's aimed at voters, not pundits, which is a crazy way.
Who would have thought?
It's a crazy way.
An election.
But that's what he's doing. And it is getting late early out there for Donald Trump. In campaigns, we talk so long about it's still early. It's not still early. His numbers are frozen. The October surprise, the thing is, the problem they have with this October surprise is nobody outside of the cult or the base cares what Donald Trump or William Barr says anymore. So they're going to indict Hunter Biden. 60% of America is going to shrug it off. Now, is there an October surprise coming from the Kremlin? Yeah, I think so. What are we going to do about that? That's a tougher question.
Gentlemen, as always, thank you so much for joining me today via Zoom. That's all the time we have. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Dr. Christina Greer. You've been watching The Election Show on MNN. Thanks again, guys. See you next week.